Week 5 begins with us looking at a central text of the Gospel of Mark. It asks, "Who do you say I am?" And it leads on to Jesus being with his disciples, and it ultimately leads to the suffering of the cross. So take a moment, switch off the video, and allow yourself to be recollected and prepared for this week's journey. Hello and welcome to week 4 of our journey through the Gospel of Mark. We are going to look at the section of the suffering of the Son of Man from chapter 8 verse 27 through to chapter 10 verse 52. These chapters contain a lot of the teaching that is in Mark's Gospel. We'll look at Peter's confession, the first passion prediction, Peter's misunderstanding, and the demands of discipleship. And we'll also look in more depth at the Transfiguration. However, in this section there's also the healing of a boy possessed, the second prediction of the Passion and more instructions for the disciples, the teaching in Mark on marriage and divorce, Jesus blesses children, riches and poverty, the third prediction of the Passion and more instructions for the disciples, and finally the healing of blind Bartimaeus. So this section is bookended with two healing stories. But this week we're going to look at Peter's confession, and in some ways chapter 8 verses 27 to 38 is the central text of Mark's Gospel. It's the climax, it's the core message. Who do people say that I am? It's the central theme of the entire Gospel. Mark has emphasized Jesus' authority as a wonder worker and a teacher. He also underlines a series of misunderstandings and reflections of Jesus by the Pharisees and the Herodians, by Jesus' family and neighbours in Nazareth, and also by his own disciples. So this week's narrative is to clarify who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. The key to understanding Jesus properly will turn out to be the mystery of the cross. Jesus, the healer and teacher, is the one who comes to tell us about the suffering Messiah, the Son of Man. To follow him means to be willing to share in his passion and death, as well as his resurrection. The journey narrative that is introduced in chapter 8 verses 22 to 26 and then concluded in chapter 10 verses 45 to 52 is where Jesus bestows sight on the blind man. By following the journey narrative, Mark's readers are also invited to come and to see Jesus and his way more clearly. In chapter 8 verses 27 to 30, that begins with Peter's confession of Jesus as the Messiah. It serves to demonstrate the kind of Messiah Jesus is. And here we see a pattern in the text. There is a prediction of Jesus' passion, death and resurrection, a misunderstanding by the disciples, and then instructions on true discipleship. Peter's confession of Jesus as the Messiah in chapter 8 verse 29 is the first use of the word Christos, since Mark used it in the first chapter in verse 1. The first prediction of the Passion appears in chapter 8 verse 31 and is also linked to a formula that we see in 8:31 and we see in 10:33 to 34. The Son of Man will be killed and after 3 days will rise again. So why do Jesus' disciples so patently fail to grasp what Jesus was telling them beforehand? By their misunderstanding and subsequent acts of treachery in the Passion narrative, they serve as a model of behaviour to be avoided. Peter's failure to accept the mystery of the cross is corrected and balanced by the positive teaching about the falling of Jesus in Mark chapter 8, verses 36 and 37. And there he is not ashamed of the Son of Man. Mark is a rich resource for those who read the Gospel, and it comes alive in the lives of Christians today. It sets before us the basic question of Mark's Gospel, and it enriches the whole New Testament. Who do people say I am? It confronts the mystery of the cross, and it challenges us to integrate the reality of Jesus' suffering into our own understanding of Jesus' suffering and discipleship. And it spells out the demands, the value, and the reward of a faithful following of Jesus. Mark presents his readers and today's readers with an exercise in right thinking about suffering. Our second text this week is the Transfiguration. It's found in Mark chapter 9, verses 1 to 13. Mark's account has essentially three elements: the sayings about the imminent coming of God's kingdom, the narrative about the transformation or the transfiguration of Jesus, and thirdly, the discussion of Jesus and his disciples about Jesus as the suffering Son of Man and John the Baptist as the Elijah figure. From the narrative, it proves the strong evidence that Jesus regarded the coming of the kingdom as future and imminent, that is, coming soon. These sayings are balanced by the accounts in Luke and Matthew, which imply that God's kingdom is already present and at least inaugurated by Jesus' ministry. When these two sets of sayings are put together, the result is the already and not yet dynamic that is typical of New Testament ecclesiology. The Transfiguration is a coming of God's kingdom and power. The reader is provided with a clue towards understanding Jesus' transfiguration as a preview or an anticipation of the fullness of the kingdom of God and of the risen Jesus' place within it. The literary genre of the text has three different aspects. Firstly, a historical report. There is a brilliance, there are supernatural features: the mountain, the transfiguration itself, the appearance of Moses and Elijah, the heavenly voice. Secondly, it could be seen as a resurrection appearance, an appearance of the risen Christ read back into the text, and at least a preview of the glory of the risen Christ. And thirdly, it can be seen as an apocalyptic vision. There are supernatural elements as well as eschatological undertones, where there's a preview of Jesus as the major character in the coming of God's kingdom. In some ways, the text has been described as a Christophany, a manifestation or a revelation of who Jesus really is, a revelation of his true identity and glorious goal to which his journey will lead. Meanwhile, the disciples are understandably puzzled and react with a mixture of awe and foolishness. There are parallels with Old Testament texts here. In Exodus chapter 24 and chapter 34, Moses is on Mount Sinai. There is a high mountain, there is a special group, there is a radiance, the cloud is there, the voice, there is a figure that is a central figure, and there is fear among the onlookers. And so the parallel text would suggest that Jesus is presented not only as the Son of God, but as the new Moses. We often read this particular text on the second Sunday of Lent. For our movie this week, we are looking at A Beautiful Mind. The main characters in that are John Nash, a mathematician, and his wife. The core beliefs are to do with the value of human life, with delusions, and with family. The changes for the individual characters is living with the limitations of a condition, support, the issue of individualization. And the universal themes that come through that are love, perseverance, and the celebration of difference. For this week's worksheet, you'll find for week 4 under the Resources tab in the parish website. It gives 6 of the Christological titles and of Jesus, and it asks the question, who do you say I am? Perhaps under each you could write a simple prayer or a reflection on what that Christological title means for you. Thank you. To conclude this week, we recollect on the texts that we have listened to. The Jezreel Valley gives us the context of the story of the Transfiguration. The Basilica of the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor gives us the modern interpretation. And we know that, as always, we are rooted in the life of Jesus of Nazareth from Galilee.
We behold the splendor of God shining on the face of Jesus. We behold the splendor of God shining on the face of the Son. Only in God is my soul at rest. In Him comes my salvation. He only is my rock, my strength and my salvation, my stronghold, my Savior. I shall not be afraid. Abba, Father, let me be yours and yours alone. May my will forever be more and more your own. Never let my heart grow cold. Never let me go. Abba, Father, let me be yours and yours alone. Transparent